Hello everybody, I'm Iain, and in this video I want to talk about the Pinan Katas, known as Heian Katas in some quarters. Specifically, the bit I want to talk about is the fact that a lot of people view them as being children's katas, or katas that were created for athletic training purposes, and kata that have no combative value. I believe that to be fundamentally wrong. I believe that they are a system, a combative system in and of themselves. And I believe the evidence for that is quite strong. So I'm not going to cover all of that in this particular video, but I've got several kind of key points that I'd like to raise with you. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is the name. So in Karate Do Kyohan, Gichin Funakoshi, the father of modern karate, writes of these kata that once you understand these 5 kata, you can be confident of your ability to defend yourself in most situations. The meaning of the name should be understood in that regard. So here we have Funakoshi telling us that these katas are a holistic physical self-protection system in and of themselves. Once you understand these 5 kata, you can be confident of your ability to defend yourself in most situations. That's pretty unambiguous, right? It then goes on to say, of course, the meaning of the name should be understood in that regard. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So if you read the characters for writing Pinan or Heian, if you were to read them from a Japanese perspective, you would come up with something like peace and tranquility. However, if you read them from a Chinese perspective, it's subtly different. It means to be to travel safely, to be free from danger, to be safe from harm. Subtly different. So Funakoshi there is telling us, the meaning of the name should be understood in regard to the fact that they are a self-protection system. So, don't read it as peace and tranquility. Read it the other way. Read it as being safe from danger. That's what it's telling us. Now, one of the things, of course, these katas were created by Anko Itosu. Itosu was a school teacher in later life, was also a scribe. This is a guy who's very skilled at languages. This is a guy who's well educated. I think he chose that name specifically on purpose because of its double meaning. So later on, and we'll talk about this in a moment or two, but later on he goes to teach these katas to children. And when he's doing that in the Japanese-run education system, he wants a name that's suitable for that purpose. Right? So Pinan, being read in a Japanese way, peace and tranquility, it's a great name. You compare this with something like the Goju names. What katas are you going to teach them? To smash and destroy, to rip and tear. No one's going to allow you to teach kids that stuff. But so what katas are you going to teach? Oh, katas called peace and tranquility. So his younger students in the Japanese-led education system will read the characters that way, right? Meanwhile, his adult students, who still consider karate to be Chinese hand at this point, that's how Itosu was wrote it. They haven't started substituting the character empty hand yet. They still think of it as a Chinese system. Meanwhile, they can read it with this subtly different meaning for its self-defense purposes that Funakoshi tells us about. So my bet would be that Itosu chose the name, although the katas, I think, did go by another name earlier, and we'll get to that. But he chose the name because it had this double meaning. So in terms of the katas being having a practical use, Funakoshi is unequivocally clear that yes, they have a practical use, because when you understand them, you can be confident of your ability to defend yourself in most situations. And he says the meaning of the name should be understood in that regard. And that's because the characters can be read in a couple of different ways. Now, I also think this is why a lot of people, when you ask them what the katas, what the name means, they'll go peaceful mind. And that's a bit of kind of linguistic gymnastics, because they kind of read it the Japanese way, peace and tranquility, but Funakoshi says that's in reference to the self-defense ability. So you'll sometimes hear things like, oh yeah, you've got a peaceful mind because you're confident in your ability to defend yourself. But I don't think that's why Funakoshi is telling us the meaning of the name should be understood in that regard. He's telling us that because the name has this double meaning, which would be perfect for the fact that you are on the one hand teaching the kata to adult students as a self-defense system, but you're also teaching it to children as a form of education. But that doesn't mean that the katas were created for that purpose. He seems to have changed the name later on, and we'll get to that now. So we do know that in 1908, Itosu wrote to the Japanese education authorities asking to be allowed to teach karate in schools and outlining the benefits of teaching karate in schools. You have to understand this in the cultural context, right? Because of that time, Japan's trying to modernize its military, realize it's fallen behind the rest of the world. One thing they need is fit, young, healthy recruits. So anything that can produce that's a positive. And the other thing, of course, is that the old style martial arts, the use of sword and spear and all that kind of stuff is now completely outdated and not regarded as being a fitting pastime anymore. It's not a viable skill. So just like they did with judo and kendo, they realized we've got to modernize, we've got to go with the zeitgeist of the time, we've got to get our martial arts relevant to the time. So Itosu was one of the early guys to start doing this for karate. Help me help our military by using karate as a means to produce fit, young, healthy recruits. So if you read the letter, that's clearly what his intent is, right? But as part of this, he goes, he says, you must decide whether karate is for physical training or for its practical use. So he acknowledges that, that karate can fulfill these two roles. On the one hand, you can do it as a form of exercise, purely as a form of exercise. And the other hand, you can do it as a pragmatic system. Again, this would reflect the name that he's chosen. Now, one of the things that people say is, oh, yes, and then he made the Pinans for that purpose. But we know he didn't. He didn't make the Pinans for that purpose. The Pinans had been around a long time before that in various guises. Itosu also taught these katas prior to going into the schools. He also taught them to his adult students, which would make no sense at all if they were just a form of kids' gymnastics, right? He taught them to the adults as well. So I think what's happened here is got to the point where I want to teach them in schools. What shall I teach them in schools? Oh, I know, these Pinan katas have developed a fairly short, there's 5 of them. Let's use those, let's use these traditional kata, these ones that he'd been teaching within a traditional framework for combative skill. Yes, let's use those, but teach them without the bunkai. So there's a lot of evidence, that he taught them to his adult students. Of course, we can't really discuss that without talking about Chanan briefly. So I don't really want to get into that. But there are records of a kata, sometimes referred to as a lost kata, but I don't believe it is lost, of Chanan that Itosu used to influence his Pinan katas. We only need to take one look at the Pinan katas to see that they draw heavily on the other kata that were out there. There are big chunks of Kashanku, Kankudai in Shotokan, Pasai Dai in Shotokan, and Chinto. Gankaku in Shotokan. We can see these big bits drawn over, even some bits from like Rohai's Mekios as well, depending on which versions you practice. So you can see that, there's these big chunks that are the same. I therefore don't believe that there was a lost kata called Chanan. I think it's more likely, although we can't know for sure, I think it's more likely that Chanan was Itosu's proto-Pinan. Because this kata is never mentioned in reference to anyone else other than Itosu, which would be strange, because what tends to happen is a kata gets taught, 2 or 3 people learn it, it moves on. You see, well, we have this kata that apparently Itosu taught, and none of his students sought to pass it on, and no one else learned it but Itosu. I think what's more likely when we look at it is what happened was Itosu had developed this Chanan kata, this summary of the other katas, trying to consolidate the combative knowledge using probably his favorite sequences from other forms and katas he'd learned, a restructuring of it, and as you would expect, this kata evolved over time. So it's not lost, it's still with us. It's just that the version of it we now have is what we refer to as the Pinan katas. On this, there's a story of Motobu going to visit Itosu. Motobu tells this story. And while they're there, Itosu says to the younger students, he says, oh, do the Pinan kata for my friend. So they do the Pinan kata, and Motobu says, oh, that's like Chanan, but it's changed a little. And he goes, yeah. He says, I've changed it quite a bit. And he says, and I've now settled on the name Pinan because the young people tell me that's better. The young people prefer it. Again, I would say this is evidence for the clever double name we talked about earlier, right? The young people prefer it because it's a nice name for young people who are only doing the kata as a form of physical exercise. But it's also being clever with languages, it has this subtle double meaning as well, and I can still teach as a combative system to the adult students. So I think another big bit of evidence, right, that these were not created where we know they were around before. Itosu was allowed to teach them in schools, right? In one guise and another. And we also know, as I say, he taught them to his adult students, which would make no sense whatsoever if they were only created for teaching to children. So the next thing I'd like to discuss, and this is a huge one, is the structure of the kata themselves, right? So if you think of them, if they were created to be a form of gymnastics or exercise, Itosu did a terrible job. There is not a demonstrable physical progression through the katas, right? There's not even a demonstrable solo technical progression through the katas, which is why most people teach Nidan, the second one, first, and in Shotokan, they've had the good sense to swap the names over to reflect that fact. So what was the order? I mean, if you look at Sandan, it's the shortest one. I would argue it's technically the easiest one. It's physically, it's the least demanding of all of them because it is so short. So why is that number 3? We all know that if you're developing a training program, you start with something simple, that's easy. And as the student gets fitter and stronger, or more flexible, or whatever you're trying to train, you advance over time. There is no sign of that advance in there. The katas aren't constructed as a form of physical exercise. So what are they constructed for? Well, my view is, and having spent decades and decades breaking down this kata, the order that they're in is based on the bunkai of the kata. And when you look into it, it's very clear. It explains why this one is number 1 as well, right? Despite the fact that most people acknowledge that number 2, in terms of solo form, is physically easier. Having broken these katas down for years and analysed them, my own personal conclusion is that there is a logical combative system that progresses not only through every individual Pinan, but through them all as a sequence. So on the first one, and I've shown this to people at loads of seminars, and you may have seen it in some of the DVDs and this, we have drills in my dojo that we teach on this. There is a demonstrable progression there. So the first one, Shodan, right? In Shotokan would be Nidan now, right? That one deals with the initial stage of the confrontation when arms start to be exchanged. It teaches us how to control limbs, to get past limbs in order to hit predominantly the jawline and the neck, right? 2 decisive targets. It also shows the basics of breaking balance. You look at Nidan, that deals with when the hands have made contact. Right, when either you've grabbed them or they've grabbed you, it's the next stage on. Sandan is a grappling kata. It's full of throws, right? Throws and setups for throws primarily in that kata. And then Yodan and Godan, I always refer to those, maybe slightly flippantly, as the masterclass and the stuff that's left. So having introduced those 3 elements, okay, then it moves on to say, okay, having learnt the fundamentals, here's options, variations, here's things you can do if the primary techniques don't work. And also these things are less likely to happen in combat, but they're still possible. So we're going to look at those as well. Again, one of Itosu's students noted that he mainly concentrated on the first 3, would only rarely teach the second 2, and then he mentions, and when he did, it was often without much enthusiasm, right? So again, I think this would maybe point to the fact that the first 3 are the fundamentals. So again, when we look at these kata themselves, I can see a very obvious combative progression running through them. There is no obvious gymnastic or physical progression running through them all. We would all acknowledge that Sandan is the shortest. We would all acknowledge it's physically the easiest in terms of technical difficulty. Did Itosu get it wrong? Did he not mean for this to be the first one? And if he did mean it to be the first one, why did he mean it to be the first one? And I think we can count out technical difficulty in terms of the solo form. We can count out physical difficulty, that's demonstrable as well. So what's left? What's the other reason? And it can only be combative. So there's loads more else I could talk about, but I think there are 3 key things that we've got to consider when it comes to looking at these katas, right? We have Funakoshi telling us unequivocally that these kata are designed for self-defense. We have him telling us that the name should be regarded that way. When we analyze the name, we can see how it would fit beautifully to this idea of a set of kata that were taught to both adults and children, but with different purposes to both groups. We have the story of Motobu telling him that Itosu deliberately chose the name Pinan because the young people preferred it, which would fit with this as well. We can look at the fact that he also taught it to the adult students. So some of the adult students were school teachers, so that would make sense. They've got to teach it to the kids, like. But Motobu, for example, wasn't a school teacher, but he seems to have learnt this kata in one form or another, right? The Chanan version, which again, to me, the evidence clearly points to it being a proto-Pinan that Itosu created. There are no other versions of this alleged lost kata that's got passed on. Why didn't any of his students pass it on? Why did nobody else learn it? Well, the obvious answer would be, well, Itosu made it, so it starts with him. And why didn't they pass it on? Because it was superseded by the Pinans we have now. It isn't lost, it evolved. And as I say, I think when we look at all of this together, to me, there is no doubt that the kata are designed to be a combative system. And certainly in terms of function, you can definitely see that there. We see movements, go down, this turning movement here, very obviously a shoulder throw, not a form of exercise. We've got all the trapping skills that Shodan introduces, the joint locking and the gripping skills that Nidan introduces. There are clear throws in Sandan, the winding throw when we turn, these movements towards the end. When you analyze them, they have a clear combative function. As a form of exercise, they're not good. You could create a routine for physical training, which would be way more effective than these. So the way I see it is that Itosu kind of created these forms to be a summary of the kata he knew. They evolved over time. The name changed over time. Eventually, he used these kata in the education of children, but they weren't created for that purpose. They were used for that purpose. The name, the nature of the kata, and the history of the kata, in my view, clearly tells us that they are combative in nature. And certainly the way that we use them in my dojo, that's how we use them, right? We learn limb control methods, joint locks, chokes, strangles, arm bars, tactical positioning, neck cranks, a whole series of throws, And we've also got to remember that great chunks of these katas are taken from the older ones, which no one disputes. They were designed definitely for combative function, and there's just big chunks of them taken out and dropped in. So if that sequence from Kanku Dai has a combative function, then the sequence that you see in the Pinans must have the same combative function, and same for Chinto and same for Basai, right? It hasn't had its combative function removed simply because it's now been practiced in another kata. The movements remain largely the same. So yeah, I'm with Funakoshi on this one, right? When you master these 5 kata, you can be confident of your ability to defend yourself in most situations. The caveat being that you also practice the bunkai, you understand the underlying principles, and you use the methods of the kata in live training too. So thanks for watching this video. I hope you found something in it interesting or thought-provoking.